So let's talk about neoconservatism. It's a big topic, and I have some notes, and I'll try to keep this somewhat focused. But as always, I can just remake the video if it turns out to be a disaster. Now, keep in mind, as with all the videos I do of this type, I understand that while there is formal scholarship on these sorts of things, this is kind of my perspective and this is my take, so it's not going to align exactly. That being said, let's just try to get into this big topic. So I bring this up just because I've been watching some TV and movies lately, and it's just something I've been noticing for a long time. Whenever you see the what would be considered the right, and I put that in quotation marks, parodied in TV shows or movies, almost always what they're parodying is neoconservatism. It's not really traditionalist conservatism, it's not the dissonant right, it's not really nationalism. It's this very specific brand of American based, I guess if you want to call it. I don't really want to use the term conservatism because it's not really, but because that's the name. This brand of American conservatism that is hyper dominant largely because of the amount of money it receives and how astroturfed it is. And it's kind of become the face of what people would associate with the right wing. And once again, I put that in quotation marks. And because of this, this tends to be the thing they're parodying in most stuff that's attacking people on the right. And the kind of the irony of it is stuff like The Boys, which is the main thing I'm thinking of at the moment, is I actually wind up agreeing with most of their parody of neoconservatives, and I kind of agree with the issues that they take with it, and I find their satire funny, even though it's probably supposed to be that in their minds they think they're satirizing me and my beliefs. But I don't really consider neoconservatism to be a right-wing ideology or even a centrist ideology. It's a left-wing, if not far-left ideology, and I'll talk about that, how that fits into my political spectrum. The difference between the reason it's not part of the modern political left is kind of a historical accident more than anything else, at least in my view. So, what is neoconservatism? I think at its core, it's a almost religious commitment to classical liberalism with the premises it brings. So on my political spectrum, I define left as being a belief that people are interchangeable, not that they're equal, because equal has a number of different meanings. It can mean equal before the law. It can mean equal before God. It could mean equal access to healthcare or education or something like that. When I say interchangeable, I mean the belief that some people aren't born smarter than others. Races, there's no difference between races, there's no difference between genders, that sort of thing. That you can take any person from any part of the world and drop them in any other part of the world, and that all things being equal, people should have the same outcomes. That given a liberal economy and a liberal political system, individual merit will naturally determine who runs society. And there really isn't any kind of ideology, I think, beyond that, you can say. The basic idea is that liberalism, and particularly liberal democracy, is the natural state of humanity. And if you bring it about, and you bring about a capitalist economy with equality of opportunity or whatever, then the societies will just work out. And I think Mark Stein referred to it as, ironically enough, every country will be Sweden, or every country we will be America, and there'll be no more war. And that all these like cultural differences or religious differences or all these other things are just kind of noise that are getting in the way of humanity becoming fundamentally equal and interchangeable. Now, you might be wondering, doesn't this kind of sound similar to the social justice narrative or the modern left? And how is this kind of distinguishable from that? I think in terms of its core ideological assumption, there really isn't a difference. And as time goes on, I think you can see that Neoconservatism has very much shifted, particularly under Trump, from being part of the Republican Party to being more and more part of the Democrats, and to being more and more of something associated with the political left. But both inherently, I think, have the same idea that all things being equal, all people are fundamentally interchangeable, and that if you only are to create a system that takes this into account, then everything will just kind of work itself out. And in terms of, I guess you could say, the more social justice side, they're more interested in equality of outcomes, whereas neoconservatives are more interested in equality of opportunity. I've been thinking about this. I think the main difference is neoconservatism tends to reject identity politics and focus on political and economic freedoms as being the key to achieving equality, whereas social justice tends to view economic and political factors as being irrelevant, whereas identity politics is everything. So, like, if you look at the modern left, they don't really seem particularly interested in things like actual socialism, like new entitlement programs, nationalizing industries, like redistributing of wealth in a general sense. It's entirely based on identity politics solutions, like giving money to black people, that sort of thing. So, like, the idea is the reason black people aren't interchangeable with white people is because of racism. Whereas if you listen to like what the neoconservatives conservative thing is, they tend to have like the Dems are the real racists because they believe in identity politics. If we just brought capitalism to black people, if we just gave them political freedom, then the results would be basically the same. So I think that's one big difference. The other difference is how such a society is going to be achieved. Now, the social justice left tends to believe that, and this might come from some Maoist roots, that political change needs to come from mass action, particularly mass violence or some sort of mass political protest, that the mob inherently conveys political legitimacy, and that's the main way to change society. Whereas neoconservatism largely rejects that sort of thing in favor of a more state-based approach. So you'll see with the social justice left, whenever there's something like Onion Sushi or, no, they hated the Yellow Vest movement, but the Green movement in Iran, or the Arab Spring, or George Floyd, if there's something they see will lead to some sort of mob violence or mob uprising, they will jump on board with that and try to ride it as a way to destroy the existing system and bring about their interchangeable world. On the other hand, neoconservatives have a much more state-based approach. My interpretation is that they believe the United States has been given a unique position, either by God, because those of neoconservatives who are Christians believe that liberal democracy is the political ideology that is stated in the Bible as being that for all of humanity. And you almost get this kind of bizarre version of like Islamic Sharia, but for Christianity, that has like the tenets of liberal democracy basically become Christian Sharia. I don't know if that comparison makes any sense, but America is this country with a unique destiny that was created as a liberal democracy for the purpose of spreading liberal democracy. And you can kind of see this is a bit similar to the socialism in one country concept that we had in the USSR, where, I mean, there's multiple interpretations of it, but one interpretation was the Soviet Union needed to become a superpower and needed to solidify its own socialism so that it could eventually spread it to the rest of the world. And so a lot of international communists kind of looked at the Soviet Union as kind of being this messianic state. And I think neoconservatives, and you'll find this with them, those that aren't in America, they tend to have a very America-centric worldview. They tend to have a very, very pro-America view, and they want to see their own countries follow the United States. I think it also very much is a form of liberal nationalism. Now, there's a bunch of different kinds of nationalism, ranging from civic nationalism, etc. I would define liberalism as the identification of the state and its core institutions and its core culture with classical liberalism, and the view that these are interchangeable. So the growth of the state in terms of its power, its military might, its economic might, its foreign influence is co-equal with the growth of international liberal democracy. So what I'm saying is America is seen as to liberal democracy what the Soviet Union was seen as to communism. So within this context, the way that the social justice left, like I said, believes that they can attain their interchangeable society is mass movements, in particular mass violence and rule by the mob. Whereas the neoconservatives think that international force, particularly led by America, because America is the strongest country in the world and America is indistinguishable from classical liberalism, is to use military force to bring this about. Because they have a more, I don't know if realist is the right view, but they have more of a view that power grows out of the barrel of a gun. That if you want to change the world, you need to do it through force. That you can't just make pretty speeches. You can't just, people don't necessarily want to be free, and they need to be made to be free. That sort of thing. That this is objectively the best state. However, people need to be educated as to why this is the best state. If they don't accept it, it needs to be pushed on them. I think it's very much can be seen as a continuation of the whole white man's burden concept or the civilizing mission. That neoconservatives see the job of America as to destroying these existing identity systems, existing, I guess you could almost say religions, etc., but just kind of converting all of the world into liberal democracies and blending them together through immigration, capitalism, corporate culture, and shared institutions, all of which will be led by an American hegemony whose purpose is to ensure that their ideology is enforced. Now, it gets kind of confusing when we get into where liberal democracy and America's national interests coalesce, because some will go with liberal democracy, but most will tend to go with America's national interests because of like their variant of socialism in one country. The survival of liberalism in America is of critical importance, and that's kind of the primary thing that matters, not so much any particular instance of democracy promotion. One of the ways in which the social justice left and the neoconservatives would differ is one believes very strongly in military force, the other believes in mass movements. And so you'll get the scenario where the societies they want to create in the end look very similar in a lot of ways. It's just a big difference in terms of how they want to achieve it. One of which is more inherently, I think, trustful of state power. The other is more inherently skeptical of it. I think an important thing to keep in mind, so we'll just move maybe on to domestic policy, is there isn't really any consistency with regards to the neoconservative view domestic policy. Or maybe that's not exactly fair. The consistency doesn't function the way that we think it does. Like when we talk about the left, people say, oh, it's not consistent because they support Islam, they also support feminism, they support all these contradictory things. But it's not really contradictory because the goal isn't Islam or feminism or any of these things. It's anti-Western, it's anti-white, it's anti-Christian, it's anti-male. It's against those things, and they will just take anything that serves their objective of destroying these things. So it's really not inherently contradictory, because whether or not feminism and Islam agree upon women's rights. Women's rights isn't the goal, it's just a tool to destroy the things that they're against. And with regards to neoconservatism, I don't think there is any particular domestic ideology beyond whatever helps their war machine to promote liberal democracy abroad. So you could see that they tend to be very flexible on things like social programs. Like under the Bush administration, we saw a massive expansion of government spending on all kinds of different stuff. They don't seem to be particularly predisposed towards expanding what they call socialism, but that's not related to government spending. So they'll just spend money on stuff like the military. They don't really want to introduce new entitlement programs or nationalize industries, but they don't really have much of an issue with deficit spending or those sorts of things. They do tend to like to cut taxes while increasing spending and run up massive deficits. But realistically, I'm not sure how much of that is related to their ideology and how much of that is just political expediency, because tax cuts are popular and throwing money at programs is popular. So those might just be like side things they don't really care about. So they don't really care about the deficit. They don't really care about the national debt or any of those things. They're not really part of their ideology, but they need votes to win elections. And one of the ways that they can pander to kind of a base is to like have rhetoric about tax cuts, is to have rhetoric about financial restraint or something to try to gain support among fiscally conservative voters. But then you also have stuff like compassionate conservatism to try to get votes from more, I guess you could say, economically centrist voters. And I think it's all just kind of a front. And that kind of also what happens when you deal with social issues. I think neoconservatism inherently is more socially liberal. I think that's the direction it really leans to, and you can see how rapidly it kind of abandons various social issues and jumps on the left's bandwagon. But I think like the association of it with like evangelical Christianity and that sort of thing, I think was purely a cynical ploy. Because both of them were anti-communist. The neoconservatives were anti-communist and the Christian right was anti-communist. So I think adopting a lot of these evangelical Christian principles, or like nominally adopting like pro-life or pro-traditional family policies, were just there to try to win them some votes and to kind of gain them support from a group portion of society that naturally had some things in common with them coming out of the Cold War anyways. Also, the Democrats more or less kicked out most of these socially conservative voters after the civil rights era. And you had all these socially conservative voters who really didn't have anywhere to go. So by moderately pandering to them, the party was able to gain that stuff. But regardless of their rhetoric, if you look at what tends to happen in countries America invades, they adopt kind of all these very socially liberal policies like feminism. Neoconservatives will actively push LGBT privileges in various countries. They'll push for things like affirmative action, for multiculturalism, for open immigration, for diversity. They'll push for kind of all these globalized multicultural things on the countries that they succeed in influencing. Even if come election time, they might pretend to stand against these things in America proper. Like I said, I think that's purely a cynical ploy to get votes. And once again, I don't think this is inconsistent necessarily. The idea is because I don't think they fundamentally care about things like domestic policy. I think it's kind of irrelevant to them. What matters is that they can get the money and they can be in the position to carry out their global agenda, to continue to spread democracy and defeat what they see as socialism and tyranny. And that kind of brings us to the whole corporate thing. Neoconservatives are very tightly associated with the military-industrial complex or multinationals or big companies in general. I think because once again, this comes from the fact that they aren't particularly ideological on issues like that. They do believe very much in capitalism as a way of bringing about equality, that once a society has achieved liberal democracy and capitalism is implemented, then everyone will be equal and they'll be able to rise and fall on their own merits. So I think they're predisposed to like that sort of thing. And the idea of tying the world together through international trade and transnational corporations and capitalism and those things are very beneficial to their agenda. But also, like I said, because they're non-ideological in a lot of these areas, they're just looking for support. So the military-industrial complex is kind of a no-brainer of people to ally themselves with, because they want war. These various companies want war, so they can get these companies to fund their political agenda and their political parties and stuff like that. And if you ever notice with neoconservatives, there's a lot of astroturfing. There's a lot of like groups or authors or publications that nobody reads and no one listens to, but receive huge sums of money from these various organizations that get money from big companies and particularly the arms industry. And so whenever you have modern conservatism or the modern right represented, it's very much corporatist. And I mean that in the rule by big corporations, not in the Catholic or traditionalist sense. And you often will see these disparate elements kind of thrown together, like you'll have evangelical Christianity that's very like capitalist in nature, that incorporates like a lot of corporate or customer service features or stuff like that. You just kind of see these weird chimeras, and that's very present in stuff like I said, The Boys and things like that. Now, I think things are changing pretty rapidly. This is partially due to Trump. I think it's also partially due to the Obama administration. Because Obama, more or less, in part, I think he came to power as an anti-Bush candidate. That people wanted a change. They wanted a break from the Bush administration. In particular, I don't think people wanted more foreign wars to spread democracy. But Obama like started a bunch. Like he got America involved in the Arab Spring. He got America involved in the Syrian Civil War, in the Libyan Civil War. I think he got them involved in Tunisia and Yemen. And I think it was Mali, a whole bunch of different wars Obama got into. I mean, he even created the Obama Doctrine, which is humanitarian interventions to promote the spread of democracy or whatever. And you just saw kind of a ramping up and not a ramping down of the policies. I don't think you saw an actual cut to military spending. I could be wrong during his time period. And you just kind of saw a continuation of very similar policies. In particular, the foreign policy. So I think a lot of Republicans who or a lot of neoconservatives who have previously been Republican started to get on board with Obama and kind of started to switch over. Now, the other issue that was happening was the emergence of Trump and a general shift among the right to more nationalist and populist policies, where I think particularly like post-Occupy Wall Street, a lot of conservatives, even ones who I would consider legitimately right-wing, became more skeptical, not necessarily of the market or capitalism, but of big companies, and kind of said, oh, they're actually the enemy. They're against us in the culture war. They're against America's interests. And kind of the Trumpian Make America Great Again thing was, let's make American nationalism means for the good of America and the American people, not for the good of international liberalism, not for the good of other countries, but for people who identify with America, people who are, I don't know, culturally, if you want to say Americans are an ethnic group, ethnically and historically American. And this was kind of anathema to the neoconservatives who view America as being solely this bastion or this tool for extending international liberal democracy. You also had the abandonment of commitments to internationalism, to free trade, to selling Americans up the river to companies in favor of a more populist, where the goal was, at least rhetorically, more that the purpose of the American state is to benefit the American people and to work in their interest, whereas the neoconservatives would say the purpose of the American state is to spread democracy globally and enforce liberal democracy in other countries, at home and abroad. And so if you look at most of the leading neoconservatives, a lot of them have snaked. They've gone over to the Democrats. The Democrats have adopted a lot of kind of neoconservative talking points and a lot of neoconservative ideological principles, whereas the right has increasingly become anti-war, I suppose you could say, more populist and more anti-free trade. I remember back when I was in university, the left used to be very anti-free trade and anti-economic globalization. And now if you support tariffs or you oppose some sort of foreign ownership of companies, that's viewed as a form of racism. And I think you're seeing that more and more in Europe and basically throughout the world. So whether or not it's going to be continue to be called neoconservatism, or they're going to call it what it is, neoliberalism, I'm not really sure, to be honest. But whether it's going to stay centered in America or if it's going to try to turn the EU into its next home, I'm not really sure. The future of the ideology, I think, is very confused, but it's really looking for a home within left-wing political parties. And I think it's going to run into a lot of trouble, especially given how much left-wing political parties hate the United States. So we're probably going to have this bipolar narrative for a long time where they hate America when a Democrat's not in power, but they love America when a Democrat's in power, and they're anti-war when a Republican's in power. Or no, they're not even anti-war because they're pro-war, and one of the criticisms against Trump is that he didn't start more wars and that he didn't get more involved in the Syrian civil war. Because I tend to believe that there would have been a war, at least a proxy war with Russia, had Hillary won. Because Hillary is a neoconservative. Even if she has other parts to her ideology, the global democracy promotion thing is a core part of it, and was a core part of the Clinton administration, as it was of Blair and a number of other leaders from the 90s and early 2000s. So I'm sorry if that was kind of confused and kind of vague. It's a really, really, really big topic to cover, and I kind of just did my best to piece through this, talk about the main ideological principles, how they kind of differ from the social justice left, maybe a bit about where I think it's going. So if this is really bad, I'll redo this video at some point, or maybe